I would introduce now our two speakers from Ecologic, Gerardo Anzaldúa, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Excellent. And Ulf Stein, that's a lot easier for me. Delighted to have you here. And as I said, and slowly, well, not slowly, slightly sort of indicated in my little talk, I think the governance issue is one of the cracking points to get the smart into the water and into the city. At least that's my experience. So I'm very much looking forward to your presentations and to the discussion afterwards.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you can see my screen. Thank you for having me here today, or having us here. So Gerardo and I will have a little talk on digital water governance, and more specifically, the challenges associated with the digitalization in the water sector. And here we can actually draw some lessons learned from an ongoing H2020 project, which is called Digital Water City. Now, when we talk of digital water governance, it's important to make sure that we actually have a common understanding what that actually means. And you may have heard other words in the same context, data governance, ICT governance. But since there is no concise definition what actually ICT governance in the context of urban water systems means, and this definition is still lacking, we actually in the project decided to adapt a very common definition for water governance, definition by Claudia Falvosto, to the context of digital innovation. And so here is our definition that we use. So we define water governance, or digital water governance, as social function that regulates the management of water resources and the provision of water services by the means of ICT solutions and at different levels of society. And this, of course, then includes either directly or indirectly actors, processes, regulation structures, and ICT solutions. Now, once the definition is clear, we would like to start by looking at current policies at EU level. And you have a clear distinction between the water domain with the Water Framework Directive, the Water Directive, and the digital domain on the other side, also with several strategies and directives in place. As you can see in the middle, there's an overlapping area, and this is actually where it's getting interesting for us as political scientists. Now, it's getting even more complex. If you think of other policy areas that play an important role, for instance, climate change, agriculture, you see that there are also these overlapping areas. And yeah, in some cases, these overlapping areas are then closed by new or revised regulation. And one action plan is actually very important here that glues actually together the water and the digital domain. It's called the Action Plan for Digital Single Market for Water Services. But as I already said, in the policy cycle, everything is always changing. So there are some regulations that are constantly under review. For instance, just to pick out one example, the climate adaptation strategy, which was adopted yesterday. And there are also new strategies coming in all the time. For instance, the European strategy for data, just to pick out one example, which was adopted last year. Now, from this bird's perspective, we jump and want to zoom in directly into one of our digital water case studies, which is the case of Berlin. And here you see an illustration that we call policy metrics. It tells us a story which policy fields are relevant. Here again, the water management and digitalization, and also what governance levels are relevant. For instance, here the EU, the national and the local level. So if we look at the water policy framework, which is the left-hand side, it is largely coherent and comprehensive with binding provisions in Berlin and proven business practices. Over the years, Germany adapted national and local regulatory frameworks, progressively to EU legislation. You will all know that. So this transposition process has been equally integrated to the digital domain, which you see on the right-hand side. Thus, I think one can say that the European Commission is, at least to some extent, a driver for innovation. There are increasing numbers of digitalization programs in place, legislative schemes, although only a few of them take the form of binding provisions. In Berlin, for instance, Berlin has now realized its own digital agenda and a series of initiatives. And one example here is, for instance, the Smart City strategy from 2015. Now, we can move from this policy mapping directly to the analysis of the water governance regime. And we can come closer to the challenges and opportunities that are relevant in this field. And here you can see the results actually from our research. We have conducted in-depth interviews in 5 major cities in Europe, which you see in the icons on the right-hand side, which is Milano, Copenhagen, Berlin, Paris, and Sofia. And we did conducted these interviews with key stakeholders. And now I want to share with you some of the findings. For the EU major cities, we found that digitalization of the water sector is driven by cost efficiency rather than by changing regulation. While EU may impose strict obligations, cities might lack expertise and also in some cases, of course, capacities to implement them on a local level. Hence, there is still a very strong need for capacity building programs. We also see that customized services through ICT solutions by water utilities for demand-side management pose issues of data protection, and data protection has been discussed already in this conference intensively. And we also see that digitalization and integrated water management are rising steadily in quantity and quality. But I think it's very important for us to understand that digital governance demands a series of preliminary steps and support, be it from the public side or also from the private companies, in order to thrive. There are some specific findings now that I also want to share for Berlin. And we see here that although there is a growing number of digitalization programs, these programs have not been quite impactful on the water sector. And we think that one of the reasons is that on all governance levels, there is still a support from legislation actually to divide the water management and digitalization. So there is actually what we call as policy scientists, policy incoherence and very little intersectorality, which is a pity because we know that digital solutions are known for supporting horizontal integration. So I think in the future, it will be very important to stronger focus on these cross-sectorial aspects, which are now still left to the national or local actors. So yes, also in Berlin, we see lots of application of ICT technologies and water management. However, we think that the potential of digital solutions is still left largely untapped. So this was actually the first glimpse into the different challenges at different governance levels. And some of these challenges that we have found are case specific, others are more, let's say, general in nature. And now with this interim conclusion, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Gerardo.
Thank you very much, Ulf. Yes, I will take the story from here, from now a slightly different angle. I'd like us now to shift the focus towards what the different stakeholder groups that make up the water sector think about the transition towards digital water. and also to talk a little bit about the collective perception that we have found is of the challenges that accompany this transition. Some of you might be familiar with the open innovation concept and the concept of quadruple helix model of innovation. For those of you who haven't seen this before, it basically takes the notion that the most adequate and impactful solutions to the challenges that society faces currently will emerge from the active and meaningful collaboration between business, academia, public administration, and civil society. The idea behind this is that the different stakeholder categories, that these four stakeholder categories and the groups within them have, of course, their own perceptions and their own perspectives towards what the main priorities are, what the key challenges are, and how best to tackle each of them. And so the idea is that combining these different perspectives and dispositions, the chances of us collectively getting to the most adequate solutions to the challenges that we see are increased. And that's more or less the idea. We've used this model in the Digital Water City project at the very start of the project, trying to get a bit of the pulse of the sector in different corners of Europe to, as I said, get a little bit of a feedback on what people were expecting, what the perspectives were, what the perceptions were in terms of what these all means for each of them. And so we identified a couple of things. If you can move forward. First of all, in terms of perceived benefits, I'm not going to say anything about this because ultimately this presentation is about the challenges, but I am an optimist, and so I decided to leave this slide in here for the other optimists around us here. So you guys can take a peek into this later on. But we identified some clearly perceived benefits from the different target groups. And now let's jump into the next slide, which actually shows the challenges, which brings us here today. A lot of them have already been mentioned. These are some of what we encountered, what we identified, and what we heard from in discussing with the different representatives from the sector. And they range, of course, some of them are directly associated to governance issues. For example, the mismatch between policy and technological development, regulatory uncertainty that drives or slows changes or implementation, and so on. They are not all sort of directly associated to governance. Some are in a secondary basis associated. Some are further down the influence level. However, these social constructs that we have that we call governance are the levers that we can use in order to address these challenges. So ultimately, these plays quite a big role into how we, first of all, understand these challenges, how we understand the people who see them, and how they provide priority to each of them. And then again, combining and joining forces in order to address each of those. So we don't have enough time to go through all of them. I've picked a couple of them to take a couple of deeper dives and show examples of. So let's have a look at those. The first one that I mentioned was inadequate fit between the current policy framework, current regulatory frameworks, and the capabilities that new technologies have. So these comes from recent review that we did in a group of the ICT for Water cluster that I had the chance to join there. We reviewed over 60 European projects that are or were working in the field of water and digitalization together. And we found quite a bit of outputs, quite a bit of outcomes as well that show have demonstrated circular economy approaches, for example, that are at their core enabled by digitalization, by the use of digital technologies, by the implementation of processes that are supported by ICT. And for example, the one that I have here in the slide is the Smart Plant project, led by one of our colleagues in Digital Water City as well. What they managed to do is to turn a wastewater treatment plant into a blue resource center, is what they call it, basically extracting the waste out of it and turning that into materials that could be either reincorporated into the cycle of the treatment plant or wider water cycle, or water cycle operations, sorry, or channeled into other value chains to develop biocomposites for construction and product development, for example. They managed to do that very successfully. However, now the project is over, recently over last year, and they are encountering the barrier of not being able to rapidly replicate or ensure that their outcomes are taken up in a widespread manner. One of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons is being that there is a lack of harmonized end of waste criteria at the EU level. So what can we do? What are we allowed to do with the materials that are, or with the waste that is coming out of wastewater treatment plants in this specific case, but we've seen this happen also in food production facilities and so on, or trying to use quote unquote waste and channeling into also food manufacturing. So this is something that governance needs to, or one of the places where governance can act as a barrier. Let's move on to the next one, Ulf, thanks. The other example that I brought up, and I sort of coined it as weak value propositions. Below this is a bit of a wider set of things, but mostly it is how we communicate. And Mr. Rabe also mentioned this in his presentation, how we communicate what impacts digitalization actually has. Again, looking through the results of the projects that we reviewed, there is very clear and growing evidence that digitalization is enabling changes in how water cycle operations work, the increases in efficiency, for example, reduction in the amount of water abstracted, materials consumed, energy demanded. So there are clear numbers there of how digitalization and systems based or supported on ICT are allowing for these changes to happen. Also, on the other end, at the end of the wastewater treatment plants, for example, there is better control, better capacity to control greenhouse gas emissions and pollutants and effluents towards the environment. However, and one level is how we communicate those benefits to people, the layperson. How do I benefit from these implementations and from these changes happening when I open the tap and pour myself a glass of water, or when I want to take a dip at the lake in my town? What does these changes at the operational level mean for me? And further, one thing that we found is that the wider environmental impact. So what this all means in terms of being able to monitor better, being able to monitor in real time and in situ and take action in the wastewater treatment plant automatically. What does all that mean in terms of the status, the ecological status of the water body? There is a big gap there. There's a big missing link between what these parametric changes mean and what the ecosystem actually sees in the end. So moving on to the last slide, which is the one on the key messages to take away. We're seeing, also taken from what Ulf mentioned, we're in the middle of a transition also in terms of the regulations, both in the water sector and both in the digitalization more broadly. So this is a moment that we should exploit as a community to ensure that there is a much better fit between the governance framework and the current technological capabilities. Second, we have to be aware that the different stakeholders and the stakeholder groups within them have distinct experiences, impressions, and perceptions of what the benefits and potential caveats of the digitalization trend are. And we need to make sure that we communicate effectively and that we ultimately collaborate actively in order to make sure that we avoid stalling in the progress and achievement of the objectives. And lastly, if we want to ensure that there is a smooth and reasonable transition towards digitalization, and by reasonable, I mean we are not digitizing the sector just for the sake of it, but really in order to improve and achieve targets that are important for society, then we will have to evolve as a sector. And in some cases, this will take fundamental changes. So that's more or less it. And I'd like to hand back to then Mr. Rabe, so we can have a little bit of a discussion with the time left. Mr. Rabe, you're still muted. Johan, you're still muted.
Apologies. Here we go. Well, thank you very much for the presentations. I would be curious to see sort of what's behind your sort of 4 last words on your last slides. In some cases, I think even fundamental change is needed. Probably we all agree, and essentially that was also one of the key key messages I put forward, to saying that the water sector isn't there yet. And this is also responding to one of the questions that are coming in now. One question for you is do you think, as policy experts, the sort of incoherence between water and digital policies is something specific there? Is that a particular weak point, or is it in other sectors as difficult? Mentioned is agriculture, energy, and there's a slight suspicion uttered that energy and digital works better together. Maybe you can reflect slightly on this.
Yeah, I can say a few words here. Well, my personal perception here is that, no, we also see this in the interaction of other policy fields as well. However, and also this observation is correct, like for energy and digital, it works out a bit better. And why is that? So I think it's not bad to say that the water sector has a tendency of being a bit conservative. And it's a very old sector, and it's not moving, or haven't been moving fast in the last centuries. Whereas in the energy sector and digital sector, things are moving rapidly at the moment. So, and I think there is a kind of a common pulse between the two. But yes, I think that it's clear that we have this kind of policy area unfit, but we have to tackle it. And also when we think about the stuff that is working in the water sector, for instance, in Germany, in the water utilities, we have people that are not super young anymore. So it will take some time until these changes are really realized on the ground in, for instance, water utilities or other parts of the water sector.
That was put very diplomatically, but maybe touching on skills, I have a question, and that's also something we try to address in the Berlin Smart City project with one of the implementation projects. The lack of skills you also mentioned. I think the question, or one on top, is the lack of skills in what places, because the digital technology, of course, is driven usually from the big tech companies, and they do have easier access to these skills, to the knowledge, to the skills, compared to utilities or let alone municipalities. And that's where sort of data governance is coming in as well. Sort of how do you establish rules for the common good, because we're here in the critical infrastructure sector, which well, take into account that the skills actually sit somewhere in a sector which is motivated differently. And that's not an accusation. I mean, the big companies, that's how it works. They want to do profit, but they are now sort of merging into, increasingly so, and even more dynamically as before, I think, into common good services provisions. So have you looked into this, sort of where the skills sit and where do you have the gaps? Sort of how could you maybe get a better cooperation between the two?
Maybe I can jump into this one first. We did find that there is, of course, in the utilities, in the operators, in the water managers areas, that's one place where this sort of lack of capacity or lack of skills or lack of willingness to jump into the water with these new technologies is one of the places where this is found. Same also thinking about public administrations and again, authorities. Not in all cases, we have a couple of cases identified where actually the public administration has been taking the lead in pushing these new solutions forward. But in general, and again, broadly speaking here, these are the two main places where we see that progress needs to be achieved in terms of how the public administrations come about with these new options that are on the table, and at the same time increasing the capacity of operators and water managers in using and picking up and really exploiting these new technologies and options.
Thank you very much. We only have 2 minutes left, I think, but maybe one more. And something which is very heavily discussed in the overall smart city debate, it's the involvement of the public. And I think, again, there's something to be learned for the water sector, which previously probably, because it's also critical infrastructure, because it was a very closed system, didn't do too much. But the question here is, can you give an example where ineffective communication to the public hindered implementation for smart water projects? Or maybe sort of that's touching on sort of where do you think this is particularly relevant to make that jump? Where is the public coming in?
I think, well, just one example where I think it's super important to have this public involvement is everything related to environmental data in policymaking. So I think in the future, maybe when environmental data, for instance, measuring water quality, this data is more publicly available, which is in a way already demanded by law. If I just think of the Umweltinformationsgesetz, then I think maybe even some shortcomings can be farther identified than it's currently the case with public administration. So we shouldn't be too scared about data security here, I think. Of course, everything needs to be checked correctly, but I would really encourage a lot of more projects in the direction of sharing environmental data so that the citizens can really be informed, but also participate in an informed debate.
Thank you very much. It's 5 o'clock. Maybe I can squeeze in another recommendation. One part of the Digital Water City project is also sort of to develop a virtual reality software, which actually helps to understand where's the groundwater. Most people don't know where it is, or well, below you, but not where exactly and how it moves. And so I think that's very much an attempt to also to reach out to the public to make this more relevant and accessible. So I think, I don't know if we have someone from the organizers in the call, but I think we're supposed to go back now because the 5 o'clock is back on the main stage. See you then in a bit.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.